Hello, 2BC, and welcome to our fall Sunday school series. Last week, we began a series called DiscipleMaking, and we had a conversation in person around the Great Commission at the end of Matthew's Gospel. And we talked about how Jesus calls all of us to be his disciples, and he also sends us out to make disciples. And so this fall, we are going to be exploring this in more detail. Both what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus, and what does it mean to make disciples? And how are those two connected? So this week, we are going to kick things off with the second lesson in our series called Who is My Disciple? And we are going to be examining what Jesus says about being a disciple in more detail. Our main passage for today is from Luke 14, verses 25 through 35. And we're going to dig in there. Our Sunday school books mention a few other passages from Matthew and from Mark. And I definitely encourage you to go and read those. They contain some similar themes and present Jesus telling his disciples similar commands, as we will see here in Luke. So go and read those. They're helpful in helping us to get a big picture of what Jesus was doing. But we're going to zoom in on Luke 14. Now, when it comes to the idea of a disciple and what is a disciple and who is a disciple of Jesus, we read through the pages of the Gospels and we see Jesus over and over again redefining or defining perhaps what a disciple is. In many ways, his disciples would have had their own preconceived ideas about what it meant to be a disciple of a teacher, of someone, and what that would look lived out. They also had an idea of what Jesus would be too. And so one of the things we see Jesus do is give them the definition, say this is actually what being a disciple is. And he redefines for them what that is going to look like for the whole of their lives. So for us too, as disciples of Jesus, as followers of Jesus, it's important for us to begin by thinking about what are those things, what are our preconceived ideas about what it means to be a disciple of Jesus? What does that look like? So I encourage you to pause here as we get started and to reflect on that. How do you define what a disciple is, or who a disciple is, and what that looks like? And for us as followers of Jesus, it's important for us to let Jesus define what it means to be a disciple. So I encourage you here right at the beginning to pause and take some time to reflect on your own preconceived notions of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, to be a disciple of Jesus. Maybe even take some time to write down those things that you think it means to be a follower of Jesus, be a disciple of Jesus, and bring those before him in prayer. And just ask God to give you an open heart to letting him transform and define what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. When you're ready, you can hit play again and we'll keep going on this conversation. So this idea of what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus is a question that we will wrestle with throughout this series. And we will continue to build on our definition. But today we're going to look at Luke 14 and see what Jesus has to say about that in this passage. So go ahead and turn with me there. We're going to be starting in verse 25 and going through verse 35. So in this passage, Jesus is talking to the crowds. We're told right here at the very beginning, large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he begins to teach. And we see Jesus teaching like this while they are on the way, while they are traveling from place to place, many times in the Gospels. And this crowd, we can presume, is this large crowd. So it's not just his disciples, his followers. It's a larger crowd of followers who are wanting to hear what Jesus has to say. And he turns to them and he gives them two warnings, followed by two parables and two more warnings. And so let's look at those. So the first two warnings, we have the first one. If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And then the second one, and whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. So in this first warning, we definitely hear some hyperbolic language. So Jesus is using hyperbole here to get his point across, that we should love him more than anything else in life, more than any family member, more than anything. That Jesus should be our master, not someone else. So the idea here is going after single-minded, single-hearted devotion, not letting anything stand in the way of following Jesus. And then the second warning, we hear a repetition of what he said earlier in Luke 9:23, where he says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it." That was 23 and 24 in Luke 9. And so we see Jesus re-emphasizing that to follow him means that he is in first place. He is the sole master, because we cannot serve two. We only can serve one master. And to follow him means that we must take up our cross, this sign of crucifixion, carry that, die to self. And it is a mentality that is an ongoing one, a day-to-day mentality. Pick up your cross and follow him. And I think it's important for us to remember here is that Jesus is not expecting his disciples to do something that he is not also doing. We're going to see Jesus, and we know what happens a few chapters later, is he is going to carry his cross. He's going to suffer. He's going to die. And as disciples, part of our task is to carry on in doing life in the same way as Jesus, to follow the master, to copy him, to live our life in a way that is patterned after his. Now, this doesn't mean that we're going to rush out and get ourselves killed, but it does mean that we are dying to our own desires, our own plans, and we are seeking what God wants first. He is our master, and he is our teacher, and we are following him and striving to do life in his way, according to his patterns. And then Jesus follows that up with two parables. The first one is the parable of a tower builder, and the second one is a parable of a king who is preparing for war. And in both of these, we get this question of counting the cost. Now, with the tower builder, Jesus is saying, who is not going to stop and consider how much it's going to cost in order to complete a building before they ever begin? And the answer is obviously someone's going to do that. They're going to figure out how much is this going to cost before I start, because nobody wants to fail and because they didn't have enough money or they didn't consider the cost beforehand. And in a similar way, he talks about a king who is preparing for war, and they're not going to just go off in willy-nilly and just go off to a fight without considering the cost. Can they defeat the enemy? Is it possible? Do they have the resources necessary? Is it possible to win? Or do they need to take another option? So these two parables are both examples of this counting the cost. And then Jesus follows up these parables with two more warnings. Let's look at those. Look down with me at verse 33. In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. So we are to give up everything. And he's talking about all possessions, all earthly things. And we should be willing to give those up, to get rid of, to break free of or renounce. So I hear in this a little bit of break free of the control of those earthly things and being willing to give up all of those earthly things in order to follow Jesus. And then the second warning is about salt. So he says in verse 34, salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. And we see salt come up a few times in the Gospels. And this idea of unsalty salt being useless is a very interesting idea, because if we were to consider actual sodium chloride, so table salt, pure table salt isn't going to lose its saltiness. But if you think about the salt that would have come from the Dead Sea, that would have been left behind in evaporation. That was the way a lot of people got salt in ancient Palestine. And the mixture wasn't necessarily a pure sodium chloride. It had other things in there. So over time, the residue that was left behind would degrade in its saltiness, flavor, and taste. And so the residue would look like salt, but it would not necessarily be salty the longer it sat there, because the salt crystals would completely dissolve. And when we think about being salty and retaining saltiness, it's this idea that we need to be all in. True disciples are salty. They exhibit the characteristics of being a disciple, and not in a surface way. They don't just look it from the outside. That is who they are. I am a disciple of Jesus, and it defines everything about me, from the way I spend my time, to the way I think, the way I act, the way I interact with other people, all of the things. Being a disciple of Jesus is an all-in kind of thing. We don't just look it from the outside, but we are it from the inside out. So it is this all or nothing. So what we have here in this passage is Jesus talking about how costly discipleship is. It requires transformation. It requires denying self, giving up everything, and not seeking earthly security or other earthly things. And it's not easy. Being a disciple of Jesus is something that should take precedence over all other relationships, all other aspects of life. And I think we should also hear in this, we are called to count the cost of following, but the opposite is also true. What is the cost of not following Jesus, of not being a disciple? And even though it's not explicitly stated here, the cost of not being a disciple is to be cut off from God, to not be able to be with him. So as we consider the words here of Jesus in this passage, I think it's important for us to ask these questions. What is it that we're holding back? Is there any part of life that we are holding back from being all in? Is there anything preventing us from being all in? How does what Jesus says about discipleship here line up with some of those preconceived ideas you have that you wrote down? What does it look like for you? What does it look like for me to be all in? These are all questions that we must wrestle with, that we need to reflect on. So I encourage you to reflect on those questions and to read through some of the questions in our DiscipleMaking study guides that you should have received. If you haven't, you can get one on Sunday in your Sunday school room. But encourage you, take some time to think deeply about this. Because at the end of the day, discipleship is this uncompromising sacrifice. Discipleship is living a life patterned after Jesus, living life in his way, according to his values and the way he dictates. And it involves being willing to sacrifice all of the things in our lives to make him Lord of our life, because he is our master. And we must be single-minded in our devotion and pursue him with everything that we have. So I hope you will join me again next week as we continue our conversation about disciples and discipleship. I'll see you then. Bye.